Okay, why don't we begin? Welcome everybody to this book launch event for Aaron Tugendhaft's Idols of ISIS. My name is David Hayes. I teach at Bard College Berlin, and this event is co-organized by Bard College Berlin and by the Social Thought Colloquium at the University of Chicago. I should mention before I forget that the event is being recorded. It will only record you if you speak. So your speaking is going to be interpreted as consent to record you. So be warned, okay? Let's see, I'll let you know about our plan. The plan is that the event will take about 90 minutes. Sorry, I'm letting people in. We're planning on about 90 minutes. First, Aaron will speak for about 5 minutes and he'll introduce the book and say a few words about how it came to be. Then we have 3 panelists tonight. They'll go in the following order: Eva Atanassow, Glenn Most, and David Kretz. Eva is a graduate of the Committee on Social Thought and faculty member at Bard College Berlin, teaching political philosophy. Glenn Most, many of you will know his writings already. He teaches at the Committee on Social Thought. And I should also mention he's a great friend of Bard College Berlin and of its earlier incarnation as the European College of Liberal Arts. We really appreciate his presence on the panel. And lastly, David Kretz is a graduate of Bard College Berlin and a current student in the Committee on Social Thought. Each of our panelists will respond to Aaron's book in about 5 to 10-ish, 12-ish minutes. We'll see what happens. And at the end of all 3 panelists, Aaron will have a response for about 15 or so minutes, and that should bring us to the halfway point, roughly. At that point, I'll open up to the audience for questions and discussion. And I would ask you to send me, David Hayes, your name in a private chat if you want to ask a question, and maybe also a word or two about what you want to ask about. And that way I can try to do some justice both to the people who get in line first, but also to the shape of the discussion, to try and give it some shape or help give it some shape. Okay. I think that's it. Aaron, have I forgotten anything? I'm sorry if I think we're ready to go then. So
I think that's great. Thank you, David. So I'm going to let you take over, letting anyone in from the waiting room at this point. Thank you so much for that welcome. Thank you, Ava, David, and Glenn, for agreeing to take on this task. It's a real honor. And thank you to all of you who have joined this evening. I'm seeing a lot of really good friends, and it's wonderful to see all of you right now. And so thank you so much for coming. So many of you already know a bit about the book, and so I don't want to speak that long about it, but I do want to share a little bit about how it came about. And I'm going to do that by sharing a PowerPoint. So, as many of you know, in February 2015, a video was released onto the internet by the Islamic State showing men with sledgehammers smashing sculptures in the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq. The video was not just a recording of an event of iconoclasm or destruction of images, but itself was a well-constructed image. It was well put together and edited. It had slow motion parts. It had parts that were sped up. It had a soundtrack. The whole thing was a well-constructed image. And so it was both a document of iconoclasm and itself an image. So an image of image destruction. So shortly upon seeing the video, I immediately thought of this image on the right and how it was so similar to one moment within the ISIS video. Both images show 3 men with sledgehammers smashing the sculpture of a king lying horizontally on the ground. The image to the left, of course, was from 2015 from Mosul. The image from the right is a drawing of an ancient Assyrian relief sculpture from the Palace of Sargon II. The relief was 2,500 years older than the video, but made only about 15 miles away from where the video was made. And so in recognizing this uncanny resemblance between these two images, I started to wonder why the continuous desire, what is this impulse to destroy images, but also why the making of images of image destruction. And so those two questions guided me in large part through the project. In addition, though, the project has a personal element. My own grandfather was born in Baghdad to a Jewish community that had lived in Iraq since the time of the Babylonian exile. And he was involved in the making of the modern state of Iraq in the 20s and 30s, a time when Iraq was incredibly diverse. And he, like other Jews, were involved in the forming of this new state with Muslims, Shia and Sunni, with Christians, with Marxists, and a whole bunch of other kinds of people. And yet, at the same time, he was a witness to the Farhud in 1941, a pogrom against Jews in Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq, which led to him fleeing Iraq with his family, first to Tehran, from where he then moved to Tel Aviv, and then to New York, which is where I was born. And so this question of how Iraq went from a deeply pluralistic society to one that was becoming more and more homogenized is a question that was also motivating me. And this continued. So the Jews leaving Iraq was just one moment in a kind of unraveling of Iraqi pluralism. Here I'm just showing two images, the one on the left, the pre-2006 ethnic areas of Baghdad. The yellow designates areas that were mixed, Sunni and Shia. And then you see post-2006, how after the American-led invasion and the violence in Iraq and the polarization that ensued, how that yellow section became quite a bit smaller. And this is a map from quite a few years ago. I don't actually know how it is today. And so what propels this polarization or undermines plurality? And finally, at the same time that ISIS was rampaging through northern Iraq and destroying those objects in the Mosul Museum, they published an article in their online magazine calling for what they called the extinction of the gray zone. The gray zone was precisely that space that was mixed, that was uncertain, that was an area where people could actually speak to each other. What ISIS was seeking in the extension of the gray zone was to polarize the entire world into two camps, two set camps, one of absolute truth and faith and the other of apostasy. And so ultimately the question for me in the book started to develop as how to think about these two problems in an intertwined way. The first, why this impulse to destroy images, and the other, why this impulse towards polarization and not, and what is it about the plurality that's necessary for real politics that's so challenging to accomplish, and how might that be connected to the issue of images? And so finally, I just have here three images representing the three chapters in the book. The three chapters going from left to right are idols. And this is an image of Ibrahim smashing the idols, a story that is recounted in the Quran and that I deal with extensively in the first chapter of the book, both the story itself, and then I use the philosophical work of Al-Farabi to develop an argument about the necessity of images for politics. The second image is a 19th century engraving of the British Museum, of the recently acquired Assyrian artifacts in the British Museum, and it represents the second chapter, which is called Museums, which deals with the question of why the video, what the significance of the video taking place in a museum has for understanding the video and ancient Near Eastern objects more generally, and the politics of imagery, or politics of images more generally than that. And then finally on the right is my Facebook page, in which we see one of the videos on Facebook. And so that this third chapter, which is called Videos, is really a chapter about the making of images of image destruction, and the way that those are circulated, both through palace walls in ancient Assyria and today on the walls of our social media devices. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the comments by the three panelists and then the conversation to ensue.
So our first panelist is Eva Atanassow.
Thank you for the invitation, Aaron, to comment on your book. I'm delighted and greatly honored to be on this panel, but also to be your colleague here in Berlin. Since Aaron joined our college, the intellectual and also the human quality of this place has been greatly enhanced, and I take this opportunity to express my gratitude. So we are here to celebrate Aaron's new book, and as is the spirit of such gatherings, also to subject it to critical considerations. Since I'm first to speak, I thought I should take the celebration part to heart. And that's the first thing I would like to say as part of my comments. Appreciate the book. Secondly, I will recap the argument of chapter 1, which was my assignment as a panelist. And thirdly, I'll briefly comment on what I take to be the main stakes of Aaron's argument, as I understand them, by way of posing a question or two for later discussion. So point 1, praise the book. I guess we'll talk about the content of the book at some length. So I thought it might be useful to begin by commenting on the form. Many of you perhaps have seen already the book. It's small, slick, elegant, tailored to the latest Paris fashion. In addition to its looks, it has an incredible internal structure. It's constructed with great economy and elegance. Not a paragraph, not a sentence, not a reference in this book that is not doing analytical work. Every word and image, every footnote is necessary to advance the logos of the argument. So to my taste and to my mind, as far as I can judge, this is a great piece of scholarly craftsmanship and an example for the rest of us of how to write and learn it in beautiful book. But this book is not only, or not simply, or not even primarily a scholarly book, I think it's fair to say. Though it certainly marshals Aaron's vast learning, this learning is mobilized to serve a civic purpose. It invites a broad and diverse audience to consider and hopefully better understand what is at stake in contemporary phenomena, from the politics in the Middle East to the main infrastructure of modern culture, that is the internet. And so the book is an intervention in public debate. And to do all this, right, clarify fundamental questions from Assyria to the internet, and do this in 100 pages takes some chutzpah. but it also takes ability and not least courage. And alongside its infinite other qualities, I would like to praise the courage of this book, which I think is threefold. It's philosophical courage to think through certain aspects and difficult aspects of, I guess, of humanity. It is political courage to step forward and talk about them in an accessible and brave way. But it's also a kind of courage, maybe for lack of a better word, I'll call it professional courage, to resist, defy, not be swayed by all kinds of pressure that contemporary academy puts on young scholars, and the straitjacket of productivity and a certain kind of productivity that it imposes on many of us. So I really admire Aaron for not going the conventional way, and for the considerable cost, I think, that he has had to face as a result of that. So yes, Aaron, alle Achtung, respect, or as they say in colloquial Polish, szacun. I could, I guess, put on a few other languages too, but may these three suffice. Okay, so now that I have duly praised the book, let me...
Now you hang me, okay.
Now let me reach for the hammer. And hammers, I should say, and philosophizing with a hammer does an important but ambiguous work in the action of the book's arguments. So when I reach for the hammer, I actually follow Aaron's lead. Okay, a quick recap of chapter 1. Chapter 1, called Idols, considers the problem of idolatry in relation to the event with which the book opens, the ISIS act of destroying ancient sculptures in the Mosul Museum, and the simultaneous filming of this act. How are we to understand this performative contradiction, an iconic act of iconoclasm? Chapter 1 unpacks this paradoxical act to show that its intention is not simply to destroy, but to ground an alternative, a new political and theological order. And it goes some length to explain why the political entails the theological and vice versa. The question why building a new regime requires destroying antique statues in a museum leads Aaron to consider fundamental political philosophical questions. What is political community? How are political communities founded? And what makes them hold? And since with ISIS, our example is in the sphere, or from the sphere of Islam, Aaron considers these fundamental questions with textual and visual help from the Islamic tradition. Aaron draws on two kinds of texts. First, texts that have served as the primary sources for the ISIS Museum Act, and to which this act stands in a self-avowed relation. Indeed, it's a kind of reenactment. That is, the stories from the life of Muhammad and Ibrahim as told in the Quran and the Hadith. The second kind of texts, and as Aaron already mentioned, include the influential interpretations of these sources, that is the Quran and the Hadith, by the quote unquote faultlessly excellent medieval thinker Al-Farabi, but also by the much less faultless 20th century ideologue of radical Islam, Sayyid Qutb, among many others, and I stress many. So here, as I see them, are the main claims of the chapter. Political community is a kind of harmony, a fitting together of many and different, potentially incommensurate parts. Now, harmony requires both plurality and coordination, many parts, as well as a principle that brings these many parts together into a polyphony rather than discordant noise. This kind of harmony as the Aristotle-inspired introduction to the book asserts, occurs in the intermediate space between two extremes. On the one hand, the project of totalizing unity, that is a kind of ancient dream of mankind, vividly described in the story of Babel in Genesis 11. And on the other hand, a chaotic free-for-all, one might say, although Aaron doesn't say it, a Hobbesian state of nature. The space for politics, in other words, is circumscribed by two inherent dangers: despotism and anarchy. Now, if political community, as Aaron's Aristotelian account presents it, requires coordination, the tuning and chiming of many disparate voices into harmony, for reasons the book elucidates, this coordination and tuning can only be accomplished with the help of images, that is, of statues, stories, and more generally, objects of human making, artifacts. Images are needed in order to mediate and illustrate, literally flesh out, abstract ideas about our relationship to the divine and to one another. Think about all the statues felt this summer, or any other summer or winter of popular discontent. I was thinking of 1989 as reading the book. So given all that, the trouble with ISIS and ISIS-like iconoclasm, because that's not actually sui generis, is not that they attack certain images, but that they wage war against images as such. Their anger is not limited to antique statues or the Mosul museum that houses them. It is directed against the idea of a museum or a statue. And the book explains why these particular ancient artifacts and the museum as such come under attack. Again, maybe to go back to the praise, I think that the way Aaron connects and interconnects, weaves together considerations of politics, religion, and art into a single investigation is truly informative and amazing here. So if images are indispensable for political life, Aaron argues, what ISIS, by reenacting a certain interpretation of its sources, is trying or claiming to accomplish is not to build an alternative political order, but to abolish politics. That they cannot effectively begin to do this without creating other images, and so engage in politics, is an inconvenient but revealing fact. The act of turning against images and against their necessary role as mediators between human and divine, or between the laws and the people, makes a twofold promise. On the one hand, the promise of an immediate relationship to God, or God's nature, as Aaron slyly adds, in a gesture to the Declaration of Independence, but perhaps also to the ambitions of modern science. The promise of an unmediated access to capital letter truth. So that's one promise, but on the other side, the other promise is ISIS vows to overcome human differences. And here I wanted to adduce two quick quotes from the radicals of the book. First from Sayyid Qutb, this is page 28. The true character of Islam, writes Qutb in Milestones, is a universal proclamation of the freedom of man from servitude to other men, the establishment of the sovereignty of God and his lordship throughout the world, the end of man's arrogance and selfishness, and the implementation of the divine law in human affairs. And another sentence from Yusuf Ali, explaining the word jahiliyyah, which actually occurs in the ISIS video, which means ignorance. The days of ignorance were the days of tribalism, feuds, and selfish accentuations of differences in man. Those days are not really yet over. It is the mission of Islam to take us away from that false mental attitude. So direct line to God and the end of exploitation. What's not to like? At long last, the lion may lie with the lamb, as the prophet Isaiah put it in a promise that Christianity made its own. And yes, while Islam, or a certain version of it, is at the center of Aaron's inquiry, well-positioned asides make clear that the issue pertains to all monotheisms and to secular universalisms also. Okay, I'm coming to my final bit. So trying to articulate the problem that Aaron poses and maybe a question I'd like to raise in this connection. So the promise is great, but the anthropological complication here, which makes this promise, which complicates the promise, is that we have no direct access to God or one another. Relating to God and other human beings requires a complex mediation of man-made things, language, culture, artifacts, whose ontological status is, to say the least, debatable. And this, Aaron claims, is a good thing. Debating the nature and value of human-made things, statutes, laws, college curricula, is not only what summons our intellect and calls forth our faculty of judgment, it is the essence of political freedom. If communal life requires the mediation of imagery, the quality of that life would reflect and be reflected in the quality of images. This prompts the question not only why within images, but what kind of images. This question is critical for the book, both in the sense of being central in its argument, but also of pertaining to the critic and the critical work the book aims to do. So the book goal, as I see it, is to articulate criteria by which we can evaluate the images and quality of our living together. So what Aaron is worried about, as far as I understand, is that universalisms, be they religious or secular, and I'm not sure, Aaron, that is legitimate to kind of extrapolate to the secular from your argument, but it seems to me that it is. So universalisms of any kind that seek to reconcile human differences by posing or necessarily imposing a single set of universal, all-encompassing norms or values are inherently despotic or leaning toward despotism, not least because they are untrue to fact, the fact of our diversity. Now, this fact, I think, requires some evaluation. Is that a natural fact, or is that a result of convention? And if convention, couldn't we perhaps overcome it? But nevertheless, the fact of our diversity is there. And so these kind of universal claims propose to overcome it by professing a direct access to God and God's nature, which even if they do have such an access, and this possibility is left open in the figure of the prophet who appears in the center of the chapter, even if there is, if such a direct access is possible, still the prophet or the philosopher or the genius scientist would have to convey, right, make somehow this insight universally available. But as soon as this prophet tries to communicate to the rest of us the nature of his or her insight, a language comes in, and with it rhetoric and politics. So as Aristotle objects to Plato's Republic and its alleged project of creating a perfect unity, pluralism and differences are not only an irreducible fact, which would take an unconscionable violence to overcome, but also a value indispensable to any decent human order. The book as a whole, then, is a defense of this pluralism and of politics and of images as both the reflection and catalyst of such a plurality. Endearingly, it is also a kind of defense of Aaron's biblical namesake. So this is my interpretation of what's going on here, which Aaron might want to correct. And here's what I worry about, and I'll take another minute. If we buy the Aristotelian argument, and I think we should up to a point, that every virtue, and by extension, every decent human arrangement is a middle between two extremes, then the kind of politics that we would want, right, is endangered on both ends. On the one hand, homogenization and universalism, a kind of totalizing universalism. But on the other, the militant particularism and a kind of tragic vision of a world as a playground of warring gods or peoples, each worshiping its own good or identity, believed to be incommensurable with those of other peoples. In such a world, deliberation and the quality of arguments seems no longer possible, right? It's no longer possible to talk about the arguments and evaluate them against a shared set of criteria. But it becomes a kind of screaming and shouting at one another, or a struggle for recognition of particular biographies. And it's no longer the quality of the argument, but the skin color of the arguer that wins the day. I would like to end with the words of the faultlessly excellent Al-Farabi. According to Al-Farabi, and this is page 22, although the truth is, quote, one and immutable, the things by which it is represented are many and different, unquote. So what worries me about Aaron's argument is that it is concerned about totalizing unity, but it doesn't present the other end, the other extreme, right? So we need plurality, yes, but we also need, as Al-Farabi says, to believe, right, to insist that truth is one, that the kind of plurality without this possibility of unity becomes cacophony and warring gods. I guess the philosophical dimension of this would be to say that you cannot have individuality or plurality without unity, that the one and the many and as somehow mutually constitutive. Luckily, I don't have time to develop this claim, but on this Parmenidean note, I hand it over to Glenn.
Thank you, Ava. Thanks to the organizers of this session. Thanks to Aaron for having written a book about images, which in this time of prolonged solitude has provided the consolation of allowing me to see at least images of a lot of my closest friends, and to remember times when we were physically together, and to look forward to other times when we will be again. Beyond this event, however, thanks to Aaron for having written a wonderful book. It's a book that is characterized by a richness and depth of scholarly knowledge, by a passion that is sometimes with difficulty kept under control, and by an engagement with the most current issues, but also with a profound awareness of historical depths. The book also has two more rare virtues. First of all, it's beautifully written. And secondly, unlike my remarks, it is mercifully short. I'm going to honor his book by raising 4 questions about it. I don't pretend that they can be answered now by him or by me, but there are questions that reading his book and thinking about it raised to me. The first question goes in the same direction as Ava's question. That question is, what is politics? I quote Aaron, page 4, politics presupposes plurality. His is a vision of an irreconcilable variety of ideas of the good life, and of politics as the art of negotiation and discussion among these in the attempt not to erase the differences, but to find a way in which they can survive and live together. This is the art of dialogue and debate. This is a very attractive vision of politics, and it happens to be mine too. But it is not the only one. And among the plurality of visions of politics in the history and in the world, there are some that refuse plurality and that advocate not trying to persuade opponents, but to suppress them. One thinks of Carl Schmitt in the past century. This is a Western tradition that in some ways goes back to Plato, and it's not, and the Aristotelian tradition that Aaron and I identify ourselves with is not the only one. So my question to Aaron is, how would you discuss the issues that you discuss in your book, not with us, but with ISIS? Given that ISIS would regard your very premise of plurality as reason enough to kill you, isn't your book in the end aimed only at people who already agree with you about politics? And doesn't it thereby demonstrate with a certain futility the limits of your vision of politics? Second question, what is an image? I again quote the author, the inestimable Aaron. Our opinions often take the form of images. We model our actions on concrete examples of virtue, justice, and beauty, page 16. When I try to understand what you mean by images, Aaron, I start to become a bit confused. Images seem to include statues, idols, visual representations of statues, visual representations of people smashing statues, but not only images, exemplary stories, paradigmatic people, symbols, metaphors, allegories. So my question here is, what is an image? Now you might say an image is all of the above, but if so, then I worry that the force of your detailed analysis of ISIS's iconoclasm and of videos and video games on the internet becomes watered down. Images become everything. And yet for the force of your book, they have to also be images in a very narrow sense. The third question, what is a museum? Your analysis of museums in chapter 2 is very rich and detailed. You show the close connection between the rise of the museum since the 18th century and European colonialism and imperialism. This is a story that has been told before, but it is a true story and one well worth recalling. But there is another and perhaps deeper issue about museums that I would like to point to here. Museums function fundamentally by an initial act of decontextualization. They remove objects from the living contexts in which they once had a function and meaning, and they transport them to another place where they are collocated with other objects, themselves uprooted and offered for our pleasure and our instruction. Good museums, of course, try to counteract this decontextualization by providing the information to visitors that they need to know in order to appreciate the objects. But this fundamental decontextualization remains the basic premise of the museum, and perhaps it even helps to create the category of the aesthetic. The aesthetic object is the one that has been decontextualized. My point is that Aaron's book is a work of forceful, learned, and passionate recontextualization. Given the images floating on the internet without context, he shows where they come from and what they mean. Aaron, if you can show your illustration 5 on page 37, that's a wonderful example. Yes, in which an image which I don't want to say went viral, but which was widely disseminated on the internet. Aaron shows that it comes from an extremely specific political agenda and an ideology which was certainly unknown to most of the people who tweeted it or who reproduced it, because they just thought it was a good thing because they didn't know the context. Thank you, Aaron. This is one example of recontextualization, but in fact, his whole book is an effort in recontextualization. Aaron's family itself was uprooted, decontextualized, and he recontextualizes himself in a moving prologue and in his dedication of the book to his Iraqi family. My question to Aaron is, what are the limits of recontextualization? Can recontextualization ever catch up with the global processes of violent decontextualization that we see all around us? Isn't there a danger that recontextualization can end up being purely consolatory and episodic? This raises then my fourth and last question, which is briefer, and it's about the coda to your book. You offer, as an alternative to the iconoclast's hammer, the image of the tuning fork, with which we can tap images and test them to see how good they are. My question is, who is to say that my tuning fork and yours will give the same results? If they don't, who will adjudicate our differences? And even if they do, won't the result be ultimately purely cognitive and hence, again, merely consolatory? Thank you, dear Aaron, for this wonderful book. My questions don't do justice to how much I liked it. I give the word to David.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's a great joy to see so many familiar faces. And it's been a great joy also to read Aaron's books, and others have sung its praise already. So in the interest of time, I'll try to keep this short. And I just want to raise one basic question, focusing on the third chapter, which has, I think, received the least attention so far. So one of the red threads running through the book is this apparent paradox that iconoclasts produce images of their acts of iconoclasm. And in the third chapter, you focus on ISIS's production of videos, destroying ancient statues as part of their recruitment effort. And you note how these visual materials employ a video game idiom. And I want to focus a bit more on this problem of play and games that you spend some time analyzing. So you ask, why would someone wish permanently to inhabit a first-person shooter video game? The kind of games that inspired ISIS's video materials and that ISIS sort of promises, an experience that ISIS promises to its recruits. And the answer the book gives is that it's a form of escapism, that games, and particularly these kinds of first-person shooters, let us escape temporarily this messy world around us, the world of politics, and transport us to a different world where roles are always clear, where the tasks are always clear. It is not a world without images, but like iconoclasm, its underlying fantasy is the fantasy of a world without politics, where sort of good and bad are clearly demarcated. And ISIS tries to make that escape permanent. Now it seems to me that as far as ISIS is concerned, and the particular kinds of video games you analyze, like Call of Duty, I'm convinced by your analysis. But it seemed that at times the book tries to make a stronger claim that play more generally is fundamentally at odds with political life. Why? Because, if I construe the argument correctly, because the ends are preset and given. And you quote Huitzinger's definition of play as an activity happening, I quote, according to rules freely accepted but absolutely binding. We accept the rules freely, but once we accept them, there is no debating the rules. Otherwise, you stop playing. And I want to offer three considerations to perhaps qualify this and recuperate in a way the notion of play a little bit in the interest of what you try to achieve in the book. So on the one thing, there's a question whether video games themselves cannot be more complex. Now, I'm not an expert on games, and I'll readily admit it's been many years since I've regularly played any kinds of video games, but I have played some, and I'm talking to people who play them a lot, and from what I gather, they're not just complex in their narratives and rich in their visuals at their best, but they also raise interesting philosophical questions at times of both theoretical and a practical nature. And there are games where players are asked to make value choices, and where, for example, you play a character, and depending on your choices, that character develops, and there are path dependencies, and you can possibly replay a game with different endings and see what consequences choices have, and those include value choices, and you know, require some deliberation about ends and, you know, who you want to be in that game. But I think, second consideration, when we look beyond video games, it becomes even clearer that some forms of play demand much more than just means-ends reasoning, and do not take us away from politics, but perhaps can enrich our capacities for thinking about political issues. And it seems to me that the paradigm case for such a kind of play is theater, of course. Theater as an institution where we, as a society, get to playfully interrogate the images that our political order draws on, without the space being political in the narrow sense of state administration. And finally, thinking about museums and your second chapter, it seems that, you know, when we think about how museums strive to be interactive in their exhibitions today, whether museums could not be a space for critically, but also creatively questioning the images precisely through a kind of playfulness with them. And perhaps the decontextualization that Glenn most mentioned museums are premised on could, you know, could be something, could support the case for that argument. Yeah, so that is my question in response to the book, which again I really enjoyed. I think it was a gripping read, highly informative, and whether certain forms of play, either in the forms of video games or theater, or perhaps through the institutions of museums, could allow us to think about images both critically and creatively, and thereby not just offer escape from politics, but return us to politics after we play in a way that we have been enriched and nurtured, and are now better prepared to engage with it in this way. Yeah, thank you so much.
So Aaron, it's your turn to respond to the panelists. And because our panelists were very thoughtful, but very bad, we are already over time. So may I suggest that you be kind of speedy so we can open it up to our audience as well.
Yeah, I think so. There's so many good friends and old friends in the audience right now that I'd much prefer to hear them and have a conversation than take up too much time now. So I will apologize in advance to say that I'm not going to be able to answer all of the questions, not even the ones that I actually think I do have an answer to, but I just in the which is not all of them, by the way, right? So to Ava's, I might have misunderstood you, Ava, but to your worry about how I spend a lot of time focusing on the dangers of extreme unity, but not the other extreme. So I think that to a certain extent, that's probably right. And I'm just gonna read one short couple of lines from page 93, 94, where I think I'm maybe trying to deal with this in my own totally wacky way in the third chapter, but maybe this doesn't speak to what you're talking about. On unveiling Facebook's redesigned newsfeed in 2013, Zuckerberg said the platform strives to provide everyone in the world with the best personal newspaper. Calibrated to individual interests and desires, every newsfeed is unique. Algorithms filter the data users produce and shape it into customized streams of information. Facebook's newsfeed mimics the Middle East peace plan announced in the satirical newspaper, The Onion. This is the line that I thought of. So this was the peace plan, quote, everyone in Middle East given own country and 317 million state solution. Facebook goes to the opposite extreme of Nimrod's homogeneous world state. Both overcome the problem of politics, but at the expense of human freedom. And so I'm sure that I don't do that side of the question justice, but all I can do right now is point to the fact that in my reflections on Facebook, I'm at least trying to think about that. And at the same time, I should say, by the way, that especially given the realities of more recent, the recent election and these types of things, one might want to challenge the account that I give here, because even if the algorithms do, in a sense, produce a situation where, in theory, we get a 317 million state, or a solution where each one of us becomes our own polis, so to speak, right? The reality, it seems, is that rather what we're getting is it tends to be polarization into distinct groups, and not just individuation, or whatever the right term for that would be. And so that's, I think, something worth thinking about, right? And then to Glenn and David, in a sense, in a way. I mean, first of all, David, thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right about the possibility of a kind of playfulness that is not just the type of play that as I describe it in the with respect to the video games. And I suppose here I want to connect it, in a sense, to the image of tapping that I develop in the coda, and thinking of that as a type of playfulness. And this goes to Glenn's points. I mean, without going into it extensively here, perhaps precisely because I fail, and I recognize this failure, I fail to go into it deeply or extensively in the book. It's really, I think, only in the coda, and in a sense, the coda's way of trying to help one think about what I've been trying to do, if not what I'm necessarily talking about in the earlier parts of the book, where I try to develop some notions of playfulness and of thinking, and the relationship of playfulness and thinking as distinct from politics, as things that are not politics, perhaps because they are necessarily much more engaged in by individuals, and that and thinking. Thinking, I really, this is an area where I want to be pushed and want to be, in a way, the book is opening up for me a necessity to think more fully about the nature of thinking and about the nature of playfulness, and how both of them connect to the type of politics that, yes, Glenn, I'm advocating, but of course it's not the same vision of politics that is ISIS's or that is Carl Schmitt's. And so, in a sense, I don't think that just handing the book would solve that, but it's certainly, at least this is I would say, my first step in an attempt to try to understand how that alternative is thinking, and how we might be able to engage it. I know that's not satisfying. I'd actually love to. I want to stop there, because I think that there are much smarter people than me here who can address some of these things. And so I want to just open things up to everybody else.